Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. If you don't know me, I'm a Microsoft MVP. Been working in the channel now for upwards of a decade, helping MSPs grow their business through Microsoft 365. We have a very exciting topic for you today around the security realm. We're going to be walking through an attack method that you can use, or attackers are using, to actually bypass what we might consider to be one of the strongest forms of MFA, which is commonly known as passkeys. You might also know them by FIDO2 keys as well. But essentially here, the example I'm going to show you in the various attack methods and tactics that somebody would use here, it's actually something I've seen in real life, consulting with an organization that got tricked into wiring over $500,000 to a fraudulent bank account. So some heavy considerations here. I'm going to walk you through some of the common methods like I mentioned, but also I'm going to pair that with all the policy settings, things that you can do within Microsoft 365 to help prevent these attacks as well too. So a lot to cover, but definitely like the channel, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this kind of content. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so let's go ahead and start to walk through how a user might get compromised, even with what we would consider a phishing-resistant form of MFA being a passkey. In this case, let's just say the organization here has said, hey, we're going to be super security conscious, and we're going to give all of our users within our organization a security key, in this case a YubiKey, FIDO2, another naming for that, naming convention. But effectively here, this is known as phishing resistant because of the overall PKI infrastructure. I went into that in a separate video if you want to check all of that out. But I want to call out that even though this is phishing resistant MFA, you could be using the Authenticator app with number matching, or you could be using older forms like an OTP code, or something like an SMS or email if you want to go really legacy. Those are weaker forms of MFA because they're not phishing resistant, but it is something that could overall play into the attack that you're going to see here. And this attack overall that I mentioned up here at the top is called either cookie hijacking, or you'll also hear the term pass the cookie. So in this particular case, our organization again said we take security very seriously. We're going to go ahead and issue these FIDO2 keys. So you have really the strongest form of MFA to sign in. Now, one thing that they can do, I mentioned this as, kind of the progression here as far as what we've seen in the past from the attacks being known, is this user says, oh, I left my laptop at the office and I'm going to use my personal device. I need to sign in and check my email from home. And this particular organization did lock down, the use case of corporate-owned devices or anything like that. They allow their users to sign in from personal devices, or it's unrestricted. They don't really have a policy behind it. So effectively here, when we get into these personal devices, there's a lot of heavy security considerations. I mentioned them here, and these are just some. It's not all-inclusive. And my example here isn't to say that this attack couldn't happen on a corporate-owned device. You just have a much higher propensity that this device is actually going to be compromised because it isn't managed, and you have a lot of considerations. I put 3 up here just for giving you examples, but we have the consideration of old hardware in this particular case. So that in and of itself is something that you could have really unpatched OS software, security patches aren't there, things like that can really leave certain vulnerabilities on the device, even 0 days as an example. And this device also might not have any AV as well. So if you have no antivirus, or maybe really weak antivirus from some third party, that malware, if it gets installed on the device, can easily disable and start to infect the device even further. So a lot of considerations there. But in this flow, they've gone ahead, they've gotten on their personal device, even though it's a really archaic device that doesn't have AV, and they've signed into Microsoft in a browser. Let's just say this is Chrome. Whenever you have this particular example here, as far as Chrome in the actual session, what gets stored here is a session cookie. And this has been going around for years as far as just this application use case. And this obviously isn't specific to Microsoft. Most websites do this. They store a session cookie so you can have a persistent session and you're not logged out every 5 minutes. It's a bad user experience. They want you to stay in your app, so it's more likely for them to have cookies and have those cookies last for a while. Now in Microsoft, they last for 1 hour. That's the default time to live on this particular session token. But what happens is when Microsoft goes to reevaluate the session, they have something known as continuous access evaluation that goes on and checks to make sure that nothing's really changed. That might be a malicious event. So a common example of that is that as an admin, you went in and you said, hey, let me go ahead and revoke their sessions. That actual session would be revoked immediately, and that cookie wouldn't refresh, right? So other things that could go on here is that they refresh the token, they see they're coming from a malicious IP address, maybe, and then they terminate the session, make you log in again. But no matter what, we have a certain level of time here that this session is open. So in this particular case, let's say this user then is looking through their email and they have this email on here. It's actually a phishing email that is disguised as their HR platform, which is known as, in this case, they're using Workday. And so this email, very common today that these threats will come through email and have malicious links in them. It's a phishing attempt, but effectively here, this email is saying something along the lines of, hey, you have to submit, or approve this time off request for Jane. Jane might be somebody you manage, right? Internal to your organization. So you click on this link, and this is a malicious link that actually installs malware on this particular device. And there's various forms of malware, that could be installed, but it's basically giving the attacker here initial access into this device. And I mentioned the link here, but there's various forms, of which they could gain this initial access here. And this isn't saying that they're signing into Microsoft here. They just clicked on this link that downloaded this malware because they didn't have, AV protections. The device wasn't patched, something like that. So in this case, we have malicious link. You could also have malicious attachment with macros in it, something like that. Cross-site scripting can be happening on websites. That's more of legacy type of attack. And then malicious executable. An example of this is you're downloading some piece of software, not from the source site, but from some repository that says they have, the capability to download Chrome, right? Or some other popular application, and they actually download malware. It's a dangerous executable. So in this particular case, the attacker has remote access into this device, maybe through shell scripting. Mimikatz is a popular one that somebody could use as far as running scripts that go against that device. And remotely here, they can actually grab and harvest the session token from Chrome. And you can see this in certain examples. I'll certainly post some within this video. But effectively here, you're basically saying that I have the session token now, and all the user or the attacker in this case has to do is they just can put it into a browser window on their device. And I'll show you guys an example of that as well, where you can actually put in this token and just refresh your page. And essentially here, you get this automatic session. So let me actually show you this right now. Yeah, I wanted to show you guys the pass the cookie attack to a certain degree here, just so you can see that I'm signed in to the account that I just used the Windows Hello option on. If you were to go into the inspect tool, application, and cookies here, you have this cookie that has this name ESTS auth persistent, and it has this token as well too. And that's my session token, that has that grant across that for what I use to sign in with. So I'm actually going to copy this as well, and you have the domain of .login.microsoftonline.com here, and I'm actually going to try to mimic this into another browser on a different device. So I'm here on a VM, and I'm in an incognito window of the browser here for Chrome, and I'm going to go to login.microsoftonline.com, and it's going to take me to the sign-in page here. I can click on inspect and click on application. I can go into the cookies here for this website. I'm going ahead and adding this cookie here for the ESTS auth persistent. I'm going to go ahead and add that copied cookie value that I got there, and I'm just going to put a dot here in front for this particular value. Now that I have this in here, I can simply just click on refresh, and nothing happened here. So what did I do wrong? Oh, I spelled this wrong here. So if we go change this to an E, and now we refresh, you'll notice here that I didn't have to do anything. I just was signed in. So on a normal attack, the user will use Mimikatz, some type of PowerShell maybe, to harvest that cookie, from the browser, and then they'll just use that and they can put it in here, and then they're signed into the account. Okay, so in that particular use case, we saw how we refreshed the token or refreshed the page there, and that was automatically kind of just generated there. And I showed you how to manually enter those session tokens into the browser and extract them, but the user or the attacker here is going to be doing that programmatically on their device, right? So just keeping that in mind. So if we continue on here, let's say, okay, this attacker now has gotten initial access. So they're in, they're in this account, and now what are they going to do next, right? So one of the things that they're commonly going to do here, because again, remember that session is only good for up to an hour. So in likely a lot of cases they're going to try to achieve what's known as persistence. So within Microsoft, there's a couple of different ways they're going to try to do that. This is not all inclusive either, right? There's multiple ways. These are some of the common ways that you'll see as well too. One of which is that you have this device join. So they'll try to join another device, maybe this device where they harvested the session token as well. And in that particular case, they're saying that they want to be seen as a trusted device on the network, right? So that's one area that they're going to try to achieve persistence. The other of which, though, is really helpful for them is to establish a secondary MFA method. So they may go on and they go to the security info within Microsoft, and they may register an OTP token. They may register an SMS phone number, and they may just register a Microsoft Authenticator app as another method there. And that way they can get back into the account, right, for most of these methods. Now, key to call out here, right, if we're really thinking tactically about this, if this was an actual passkey, if they generated a token here for or an MFA method and they're using something like Authenticator, you'd also have to be kind of using passwordless functions within the tenant, because they wouldn't know the password still if they just use this method. But there's other methods like man in the middle where they could grab the username password as well as that MFA token, and then they can register another method. So just want to call that out if you guys are really paying attention there. It's good to note here, because while they can do that, they would really need the secondary form unless it was set up as kind of a passwordless method. Now, what they do from there here, really depends on their goals and what they're trying to accomplish within the account. So in a lot of cases, they may try to run a campaign, we'll get into that here in a second, to try to extract certain information or get users to take certain actions. They may move laterally. They might want to say, I'm in Jane's account, I've compromised Jane, but Jim, I've actually found out through reconnaissance, is actually the controller within the organization. He works the finances, I want to get to him, so I need to compromise his account. You might also see them try to elevate the privileges, so find an account that has admin rights, so they can take more damage or do more damage within the account. They could also just, saying that you want to perform some malicious action like sending a bunch of, fake spam out of the account. That's known as, more of the phishing concepts. Certainly a lot of protections that we can look at there. In this particular use case, though, for my example, they're just going to be moving money to an illegitimate bank account. And this is very common as well too. Huntress actually came out with a new report where it talked about business email compromise. And I think it's over 40% of business email compromise actually had malicious inbox rules, or the change in inbox rules was a direct result of that compromise as well too. So this is very common that an attacker will get in there and they'll start to set mailbox rules in Outlook. Number one, they'll start to clean up, where they initially entered. So that original email, maybe that Workday email, they delete that, remove it from their deleted folder as well. They're really trying to avoid detection, right, within the account. They want to maintain persistence, avoid detection, and also, try to step to their next goal. So the other thing they want to do here, if they're going to start to try to move laterally or compromise other users within the organization here, is they're going to send out maybe a campaign, maybe on a large scale, but they may be doing individual users after they do some reconnaissance, identify that, again, maybe Jim is the controller. They figure that out by going into Teams, seeing the organizational chart. Very commonly can get some social engineering maybe even involved with that. But when they send out this campaign, they may be sending it to multiple users within the organization. And then they'll set up these inbox rules here so that if Jim replies, they're automatically going to mark that email as read, and they're going to move it to the archive so that the real user, maybe that's Jane, who was compromised to begin with, does not see those messages come through and saying, why is Jim messaging me back? I didn't send him this and all that, because they're, again, trying to avoid detection. So this campaign here, again, could be on a broad scale, especially on an enterprise where they're mass messaging a lot of people, but in some cases, SMB especially, they may be just messaging 1 to 2 to 3 people as well. And in this case, the organization that I referenced here as well too, they got them to go ahead and actually exchange various bank account information for one of their common third-party vendors that they pay on a recurring basis, right? So this is somebody that they paid on a quarterly basis, but they got them to go ahead and update the bank account information here. You could also do this if they really, were crafty and really wanted to get sophisticated with another malicious link here, right? That's their information to update it, and that's simply saying that they have a portal that maybe looks like the existing vendor. It's got a bank account information page where they say, hey, enter your details about your wire or your ACH payment, right? And in that way, they've just then modified, the payment details, and they've gotten the money transferred to this fraudulent account, which is usually kind of like a host account that the attacker will then decommission after the fact to remove their traces there. So certainly a lot that we went through there, but it's interesting to me because we have multiple things going on, and there's a lot of intelligence behind these attacks. There's a lot of prep work, and honestly, from a time perspective, this could take months, to evolve. Especially, obviously they need to get persistence here, but they may get persistence and they may stay in this reconnaissance mode, just reading emails that are coming through, getting to know the organization better, understanding where sensitive data like IP might exist, or who's in the finance department, things like that. They may be doing that for months if they're not detected. So you have to keep that in mind too from a time frame perspective. But now let's go ahead and go back here. I want to revisit the entire timeline, and I want to talk to you about some of the protections that you can put into place with Microsoft 365 and the various things that you have within your packaging. Specifically, I want to speak to Microsoft Business Premium. I talk to SMB a lot in my videos, and Business Premium is the best value for your buck as far as security features and functionality, but I'll key these out as we keep going here. So if we start at step 1 here, obviously, we have considerations for phishing-resistant MFA. So if you weren't on phishing-resistant, if you were just using OTP or something like SMS or email, definitely a good way to step up is to go into more of your phishing-resistant types like Windows Hello or the pass keys here or the YubiKeys that you can do. Again, check out my video to see more on those. But if we go down, sorry, I keep doing that. If we go down to number 2 here with the personal device, really, ultimately you should just say that we don't support corporate access on personal devices. Now, this is very hard to do, I think, especially in SMB. There's various things that you can do to combat that. But one way, that you can combat that, if you said, we're going to support this, is to support maybe a light MDM option. That is to say that maybe you don't push out, all the policies that you normally would to a fully managed device, but you have some basic checks and balances here. So from a compliance perspective, you might say that I want to encapsulate at least these basic functions, right? And these are, again, just some examples here, but you may say that the OS has to be a certain minimum version for you to be able to access that information. You may say that AV has to be present on that device. You may say that has to be at a certain patch level, right? So there's some considerations there. You shouldn't just say blanketly like all personal devices, no matter what it is, has access, because that's where you get really exposed and your propensity to get breached goes up a lot from that perspective as well too. So I'd say, from this perspective, if you're going to have to support it, try to support it in this way. You can also use device compliance policies in Intune if you're using Intune as your MDM, and you could say block if this device isn't in a compliant state, right? That's a good way to protect against that. I'll link all this in the blog post that I'll link below so you have information on all these, but these are just some of the examples here that I wanted to show. Next here, the session cookie being stored. I talked about one thing here, which is the level of which that you get the time to live, right? This is 1 hour that we have here, but with conditional access policies, you can actually set the session to not be persistent, right? We have the continuous access evaluation going on. We could say that after an hour, you have to sign back in again. Now, I don't like that, and I'll show you another conditional access policy here in a few minutes that I like better than that one, because this is really disruptive for end users. Remember, we're always trying to balance security and end user disruption, and this really makes people angry. If you start kicking them out every hour and making them sign back in again, you're going to be hated as that IT guy. So important thing to call out there, but it is possible, link to that as well too, where you can limit the sessions. Generally, the only time I recommend doing this is for people that are in highly privileged roles. So like if you elevate to a global administrator, then I think it's warranted that you should have, your session capped, because that's just reducing your attack surface, right? For somebody who's super privileged. Now, next thing here we have is this kind of malicious link and malicious attachment that comes through here. And so when we think about our protections there, really Defender for Office 365 is where we get some of this stuff here, such as our link protection. And this is real-time click protection that we get, right? So if this user clicks on this email, it's going to scan this malicious link and really sandbox this and really detonate it, right, in an isolated environment to see whether or not this is malicious. And we also get native phishing protections, right? So depending on the email header information, depending on the statistical data about what's coming through here, it also could potentially just block this email altogether, because it can determine overall that it's a phishing attempt, on the device as well too. On the device itself, physically, let's say, we got past all this, still hit the link here. You also have protections here with Windows Defender. And this is both, our AV protections that we can manage through Intune, if you've enrolled the devices into Intune and through Defender, as well as some of the default policies that exist, which is, again, come back to the hardware, the personal devices, you may not have that AV on there as well too. So just a consideration there. But Defender is another, great endpoint protection type of software there that can go ahead and prevent that attack from happening as well. Just contain it right then and there. So we go into more of the harvesting here. This is where the main conditional access policy comes into play that I want to show, which is simply saying that when you go through this here, you have your continuous access evaluation, right, the CAE that I talked about. But if it's in this session, we can also do what's known as strict location conditional access evaluation. And this is all part of a conditional access policy that you can set up that I'll show you here as well too. But effectively, all you're doing is saying that we have set up trusted locations in Entra that users can log in from, or are quote-unquote approved locations, right? And this is IP based. This is kind of conflicting to me because it gets into more legacy type of architecture. We're talking about trusted firewalls, perimeter networks, things like that, because it's such a condensed, isolated system. But what this does as far as this policy is that if this attacker here harvests the session token and then they tried to replay it into their browser, they would actually get blocked here because the IP would not match the trusted location. And so this would effectively fail and they wouldn't be able to log in. You would be shut down at that point in time. Now again, it is important to mention that with conditional access evaluation, it could evaluate the IP, when it's reevaluating the session and say, oh, actually this IP is really malicious, right? It's coming from a Tor browser or something like that. But if a user or attacker is masking that, another way that that could be blocked here as far as, just having that shut down completely. Again, this is harder to achieve because you're talking about having trusted locations where a lot of us today work in a hybrid remote environment. We don't know all the IP addresses that users are logging in from. So harder to do here, but this is effectively what's shutting this down. Microsoft's also in a public preview with a policy that's around session tokens, and in their articles, report article information about it, they touch on how web cookies aren't supported today, but does imply that they will be supported in the future. I'm hoping so that we can just avoid or block this type of attack without having to have the strict location or CIE set up here too. So now getting into the persistence, right? These are other methods here that a user can use, and this is regardless of any attack, right? Persistence is always going to be something. If a user is compromised, this is always going to happen. So if we have these methods here, we have a device join, we have MFA method. Both of these actually, we talk about protections here. Both of these can actually be handled with conditional access policies. And this is under the user actions section under targeted applications. So under there, you'll see user actions, which is register security information, which includes both the self-service password stuff as well as MFA, another MFA method. And then you have registering or joining a device to Azure AD or Entra ID now, as it's better known. And this, you could say, you could grant that, but you require, additional protections. So this is also where, a lot of people have set up policy to say, number one, you're in a trusted location, right? So you're saying, hey, you're in a trusted location here for this to be granted, so for you, in order to do this, you have to be on a trusted IP. So that could stop that from happening. You could also say you're going to require another MFA request in order to do this. So in order to join a device, you have to fulfill an MFA request. With this session, they basically be prompt to re-authenticate, if you will, with MFA, and they wouldn't be able to do that in this particular use case. All right, so those are just a couple of ways you could lock this down as well. Many different things you can do there, but this is a good conditional access policy to put into place here as well too. So as far as next steps, they run through all this when they're doing the reconnaissance and the things within the account. There is some things that you can look to set up here that are native as well with the inbox rules. And this is again where we come back to Defender for Office 365. There's some native alerts here that they have. And one of those is creating an inbox rule. So it's actually going to send an alert to the admins in the account. But in a lot of cases, what I've found is MSPs don't actually hook this up to their PSA by default. So what you want to do is go into those settings there, and you just want to redirect these alerts to go into the PSA tool so that you can actually track these as well too. And that natively captures, this is a suspicious inbox rule that was just created where it's, either manipulating this or forwarding it to an external domain if you don't have that policy set up with transport rules as well. But this can help you identify potential indicators of compromise with your users, right? And this will all flow into the Defender portal, but we also have Defender for Cloud Apps, which is another tool that you can use that has a native alert policy for suspicious inbox rules. Can configure it as well. You get all this with Business Premium too. So it's really important to note that good way to get ahead of trying to identify if a user's actually been compromised as well too. And then this campaign, right? Again, we have, in this particular case, link protection here, maybe for this one. But with these campaigns, especially when a user is being asked to manipulate financial information, this should be something that's like very alarming to the user if they see that, especially coming from an email and maybe worded weird because this isn't how Jane talks. But that's the point of reconnaissance. The attacker will actually learn the kind of the dialogue, the nomenclature that this person uses maybe over months, and they can actually write a message that seems very much realistic to another person within the organization, or maybe it's an external user that's a supplier, something like that. But their red flag should really go off here, right? Whenever you're saying, hey, they're asking me to change financial data, you should really be doing your due diligence. And ultimately, the best thing that you get with this, or the best thing that you can do for this, is just security awareness training, in my mind, today. And that's really just training the users to help identify these types of things, but also, this is part of your basic core training. It's part of the value add of you being an MSP, is to train them on, looking for this type of information here as well. And this is something that every user should have on high alert. So with that, I want to quickly just take you through some of these policies within the Microsoft portal, just so you can see them as well, where they're located. And again, I'll link all this information below in my blog post. So let's head over and see that now. So I'm here in the Entra Admin Center to start to show you some of these policies. Many of you are familiar already with conditional access, so I'm not going to cover what conditional access is as part of this video. But in this, I'm going to go ahead and create what I would consider one of the strongest policies for what we talked about, which is strict conditional access evaluation. Basically, you would select, certain users or groups for this. You probably would want to exclude a break glass user just to make sure you don't lock yourself out of the account. You can include targeted resources such as Exchange and SharePoint for this. In your network section, you would include a trusted network location. So you could do selected, or you could do all, depending on how you have this configured. You could do the grant controls. You could require, MFA. You could require your authentication strength to be your phishing-resistant MFA as well. So you could put that in there for the requirement. And then from there, under sessions, what you would do is you would click on the Customize Continuous Access Evaluation, and then use the strictly enforced location policies. I'd always turn these policies into report only, so you can just see the traffic in your organization before you turn anything on. But this is where we would have that breakdown where if the user, or the attacker I should say, acquired your session token, try to enter it into a browser on their device, they would be coming from an IP maybe that's not and should not be in your trusted location list, and that would immediately break down the session for them, and they wouldn't be able to log in like we saw in our example. This is the other one that I mentioned here that's in preview. You can click on this and you can go to the support article to see more about that. You'll notice that there is this exclusion for web-based cookies at this particular point in time of this recording. Maybe by the time you're watching this, this will support web cookies. So if you see this one, definitely check out the support article to review that. But this is something that I hope will overcome this, because I do think it's really hard, again, to try to get into our trusted networks and locations for the things that we're doing here. Some of the other conditional access policies, again, not going to go through these too much in depth, but for persistence techniques, under the targeted resources here, you can go under user actions. And this is where I was mentioning you can click for security information, which is both MFA and the self-service password reset settings. And you could require, another MFA push under the grant, or you could require it to be coming from a trusted location. As part of that, you would have to create one policy for device join and one policy for MFA registration. That's all part of my recommended baselines that you can find on my website tied to the CIS controls. So definitely check that out as far as reviewing those and being able to monitor against those as well too. You have your identity protection settings in here that I mentioned. Ideally, this could try to find risky sign-ins, for what we're looking at. I don't have any in this tenant, but even with an Entra IDP1 license, you can see these risk detections based off of maybe malicious IPs, things like that, risky users, and more of the identity protection policies that you can create, which automatically take into consideration high-risk users and enforce certain policies like blocking them completely from sign-in, is more of an Entra IDP2 setting, which I'd highly recommend if you're an MSP to configure, because you get that licensing part of your partnership with Microsoft for free. There's trial licensing that you can get as well.
But for your customers, most likely, most of us out there don't have P2. Just saying that as bluntly because that's what exists in the market today. So just check that out. Those are a couple of those settings here for what we're looking at. Let's pivot over to the Intune Admin Center as well. Okay, so in Intune, we have our devices, right? And we are enrolling them. A lot of us have set up auto enrollment for MDM. You haven't tapped into Intune. I have a whole course on Udemy if you want to get kind of a kickstart to this, but they come across, obviously as personal or corporate. And we're saying we only want to support corporate owned devices, or like I mentioned, if you do need to support personal, you kind of have some requirements for baseline settings. And you can really do that within the compliance policies here for what you're looking at. So we could set a Windows 10 baseline and above. So I'm just going to say test for this for right now. And then you have all of your compliance settings here as well too. So some of the basic ones you might want to have is like this device at least has BitLocker configured. It's a minimum OS version, right? So we're saying it has got recent patches, or at least it's running on a certain version that we could support. And then, some things like it's running some antivirus, or it has firewall configured, for these particular settings. This is where you can pair this with both Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business. It's more commonly known in the SMB space for the packaging that you get. But also it pairs with conditional access policies as well too. So actions for non-compliance, you would say that it's in a non-compliant state. And then when you're done here, you can go into conditional access, and you could basically create this policy within here. And this is one of the most restricted policies, I will say. So you have to be prepared to support this from an operational sense, but under your grant controls, you would say the device has to be marked as compliant, right, for you to be able to do that. You could also say the device has to be required Microsoft Entra hybrid join device, or you could say within the other targeted resources or conditions here that will the filter for devices. You say yes to this. You could say the device ownership. If I look for that one here, is equal to company for one of these designations. There's another one in here where it's the trust type. And if you're cloud native, you could also say it's Entra joined versus just Entra registered. That's usually where you get into. Joined is typically something that is classified as a corporate device, and registered is like if you have auto enrollment turned on, anybody can just enroll into MDM, even their personal device, when they try to sign into Microsoft in the thick client applications on their desktop or whatnot. So good settings to kind of configure there. The other components that you get into here with what we're looking at is if you go into Windows here, platform, you go into Windows enrollment, you have these various settings in here, and then you can look into device platform restrictions, and under the default, you can configure these properties here. And what I typically recommend, if you can support it, is to just block personally owned devices from enrolling in the MDM solution. So again, we're just saying corporate owned devices. You can set up app protection policies for mobile devices to allow support on their personal cell phones. That's really granular and secure in my mind, to allow for that flexibility. But those are some of the other settings that you can configure in here. And obviously within endpoint security, you can also configure your antivirus setting for Windows Defender and configure these policies as well. And it natively has that connection, obviously, with endpoint or Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business. So that's just another setting that you can see in here. I'll cover all these more in depth. I just want to poke around. I know this is maybe a lot for you to take in if you've never seen these settings. But I just wanted to show you where these are located. So the last ones I'm going to show you is in the Defender portal as well. All right, so I'm here in the Defender Admin Center, and within here, we have a lot of different consolidation now, which I think is good. It confuses a lot of people, and natively so. I mean, we've moved through different portals over time here as well. But if you have Defender for Endpoint or Defender for Business, this is where all your incidents and alerts will kind of triage through across your devices. You have vulnerability management in here to track real-time threats, things like software vulnerabilities on devices, unpatched systems, known CVEs on devices, things like that as well. But within the email and collaboration, this is also where you get into your Defender for Office 365 settings. Under your threat policies here is where you can configure your anti-phishing, your safe links, and safe attachments. Anti-malware obviously as well too. You have some that are set up by default here, but I typically like to modify those just because of the end user settings and all that. It's part of my high level hardening policy recommendations, but this is where you get that real-time click protection or scanning in the sandboxed environment to detonate those files to help prevent against phishing attacks or obviously the malware that they could be trying to install on those devices. So that's a good way to help with that. And obviously the anti-phishing policies to maybe prevent it from the email from even being sent to begin with, right? For what we're looking at there. The other things that you can do within here is, if I go back to policies and rules, you have your alert policies. And this is where, again, we have this library of alerts by default in the admin portal. And by default, again, you only have these alerts going to the global administrators on file. And you have, various ones that relate to the email flow, like suspicious email sending patterns detected. You have email messages removed after delivery. You also have, where's the main one here that I want to look at? Suspicious email forwarding activity. That's within here as well. Email sending limit exceeded. So there's a lot of native great alerts in here that can also help you detect business email compromise throughout the account. And within these, you can have these on, you have these alert settings, but your recipients here is the tenant admins. So this is where I was mentioning you can modify these and set it to your PSA email connector, and just have those flow through, be triaged, throughout your environment there, so that either your help desk or your SOC team, if you're that big, you have your own internal SOC, something like that, or your security team can kind of monitor these, and you have them flowing through one account across your customers. It's a little bit easier to manage, and then they would investigate through here across the board. You can also look at campaigns that might be going on. You can do investigations, real-time detections. So it's a good way to at least triage and kind of get ahead of maybe somebody who has achieved persistence and is trying to hide their identity within the account. So that's everything I wanted to show for you guys in today's video. Hope this was helpful. Definitely comment below with any questions you had about the things that I covered. And as always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. I'll see you guys next week.